Hello, everyone. We continue the work through, as you read into the book by McGrath and also work into your reading the Ian Barber. Especially as you get into Barber, the reading will get a little bit more technical. It won't be as fast a reading as, say, McGrath, or definitely not Mitchell. But especially as you're working through McGrath, I want you to think about the idea that there are three different models, really, three dominant models of how people have integrated or seen the conflict or the integration or the relationship between science and faith. These three models tend to fall into, many people can describe it in a number of different ways, but they tend to fall into three different categories. There's the against model, where science versus faith, or faith versus science, and that tends to be where scientific discovery and faith are somehow at odds, and that's where the conflict typically lies. And then there's the separate model, where it's like faith is fine, science is fine, as long as you keep them separate. So the against model, you see that more in the Bill Nye versus Ken Ham debate. The separation model, you see that in Francis Bacon's non-overlapping magisteria. That was question 3 from your essay exam. Question 3. And that's where you have the separation model, where these are fine, just don't make them intertwine. They're not supposed to come in or overlap at all. A non-overlapping magisteria. That's more the separate model. And then there's the integration model, where they see that as where some will see, okay, science and faith is dealing both with the created world. The world, and a person of faith sees this as the world and all that is in it is the product of God's creativity, whether it's going to be things that intangible things one believes, or whether it's the tangible things one observes. It doesn't matter. All of it is fair game, and therefore it's okay to integrate them. Give an example. They're particularly in the field of psychology, where you oftentimes have there are some who believe that, particularly in your more fundamentalist circles, who think that psychology is somehow something that tries to eradicate faith wherever it can, and so therefore they see psychology as somehow being net negative. And in their view, you only need to be exposed to sacred literature and to talk about matters of faith and sacred literature in order to fully pursue mental health. And the idea of psychology, psychologists, counseling in a secular arena, they would eschew this and reject it, considering that is somehow antithetical to their faith, and for them, only reading sacred literature and only reading the Bible would be sufficient for all aspects of mental health. That's the against model. You see this in fundamentalist arenas. There's a college that I even taught at that had that as their philosophy. They maintained what they called a biblical counseling degree and department. And the reason why they called it biblical counseling is because they refused to call it just counseling or psychology, because in their mind, you only need to be exposed to sacred literature and need to read the Bible in order to pursue all avenues of mental health. That's the against model. And the against model tends to be not just on the faith side, but also sometimes even on the science side, where you do come across those who see faith as, they say, well, you started it, faith was already anti-science, and so therefore the view is, from the secular perspective, keep faith out of this because it's already burned us already. And so you see the against model of science that will come from both sides of the camp. There may be Christian educators that themselves will be very suspicious of all things scientific, because in their view, they're convinced that, and particularly evolutionary scientists, are out to try to just suck up the souls and the faith of anyone who goes into university, and therefore they promote They promote young high schoolers to go into Christian colleges and maintain the Christian university and maintain that alternate education, lest their children go off and become the next generation of pagans. But there's also the other side too, where professors over times, and you might even encounter them at University of Houston. I know that some have even thought that I was that person, who are so tired of combative people of faith coming into their class that they set up a scenario within their class to kind of squash or suppress religious talk at the very first class. You think, well, why would they do this? Well, because they've had their class interrupted so many times by a combative Christian or a combative person of faith that was taught from their own houses of worship to try to confront every idea that you disagree with when you go off to university, and it just gets tiring. And so many on the science side have been encountered people of faith that are so combative that they're against it. It's like there's nothing good can come from this. So the against model of science and faith can come from both sides. Now, there's the against model, and then there's the separation model. The separation model is this idea that one is not against the other, so long as the two don't touch. It's like two chemicals that react to one another if they come in contact. So long as you keep them apart, they're both stable substances. And therefore, in many cases, the faith will say, okay, we're over here, we cover our own arena, and we don't opine, we don't try to integrate science just because that gets into dangerous territory. And so we're only dealing with faith assertions. Many people will even read the Bible this way, saying that, okay, the Bible contains a great deal of myths and stories that aren't meant to be taken as scientific fact. They decide that none of the Bible, therefore, is to be taken as historical. Well, archaeology would differ with that. There's actually considerable evidence for historic core behind many of the stories within the Bible. So you don't want to overstate that to the point where you're actually going against archaeological findings that go, no, actually, certain place names that are invoked in the Bible are in certain customs and certain ways of human interaction, certain worship styles, certain cultural patterns. These actually have been supported archaeologically, not just the places, but the habits and things like that. So it's just because, and that's, so don't suggest that therefore nothing about the biblical narratives is therefore historically trustworthy. That's overstating it. But that's oftentimes the direction people go. Well, they'll say, okay, it's sacred literature. It only deals with people's personal faith. It's absolutely of no value as a historic document. Well, that overstates it. So that's the separation model, though. Well, people say, well, it's a sacred book. It has no historic value. Well, you've gone too far in separating it out. Well, then the separation model says, well, therefore, we only are going to use, we also says, science is fine, keep it over here in its separate category, and don't ever let it speak to faith assertions, so long as you keep them separate, so long as science doesn't try to speculate as to the interaction of mankind with God, with the deities, with spirits, so long as science doesn't try to figure out using logic or probabilities or any sort of empirical data how it is that people interact with the divine or the supernatural, that it'll be fine, but you have to keep them separate. So again, there's the against model, and then there's the separation model, and then there's the third model, and that's the integrative model. The integrative model sees the conflict as artificial and knows that you need to be careful when you bring science and faith together. The integration model knows you need to be careful about this, but still, though, on a case-by-case basis is willing to go for it anyway, knowing that sometimes scientific processes, scientific data, scientific explanations need to be applied to, say, sacred literature, and vice versa. Sometimes the voice of faith speaks to scientific discoveries and says, okay, we see through scientific discoveries, through empirical data, through our analysis and through our findings, we uncover many more of the mysteries of the universe, and this winds up having benefit to the one who is wanting to stand in awe of the Creator. So there is some, there's some rationale for seeing those integrate, but those who engage in the integration model know to be careful about it. So again, 3 models of looking at the relationship between science and faith. There's the against model, there's the separation model, and then there's the integrative model. I tend to favor the integration model simply because, for me, there are ways in which, of course, I fall into the last category where scientific discovery makes you more in awe. I mean, by examining the creation, you see a little bit more of the character of the Creator. Then, in like manner, discoveries archaeologically, scientifically, historically, and so forth, helps inform your views at what things you see in faith. So, for example, the sacred literature, like the interpretation of the Bible, the assumption is that the interpretation of the Bible needs to be informed by what you learn outside of reading the Bible. So if the scientific discovery simply doesn't allow for a young earth model a young earth creationist explanation of human origins and the age of the earth, simply doesn't allow for that, that has to inform you going back and looking at, say, certain passages of the book of Genesis. Or it has to inform you going back and interpreting some of these things, going, what must this relationship, what must this literature be doing? Because it's unlikely that it is trying to teach me straight history. That is not, first of all, that's almost never the point of the ancient creation stories. But in this case, it's not likely because it simply isn't scientifically possible. Also, it needs to help inform when you're reading other stories that have a supposed historic core to it. It helps you see what more is going on and appreciate the literary devices that are being used when you know that archaeologically, scientifically, when you know that if it's just straight historic reporting, that actually doesn't work with what we are able to look at scientifically outside of that literature. So the 3 models that I want you to consider, and these can be reflected in your paper as well, are these 3 models of the relationship, or for dealing with the relationship between science and faith, are the against model, where science and faith are against one another. They're antithetical. There's the separation model, and that's where you keep just both separate. And this model was kind of shown a little bit in the Mitchell book with regard to non-overlapping magisteria. And then lastly, there's the integrated model, where on a case-by-case basis, not fully, you understand that there are challenges with this, but on a case-by-case basis, you allow these two to inform each other. How science informs your faith, and how faith informs your science as well. So keep these things in mind as you continue with your reading in McGrath. Consider how you might work those into your paper, and there may be an aspect of that comes up in an essay question. All right?